Last time I introduced loading for assets, interaction and an inventory system for the player, so I could load in a weapon and pick it up. From there I introduced the framework for the combat, with weapon drawing and a way to chain attack animations through a button press. This time I continue to expand and iterate these systems, so let's not waste any time and get right into it. So first of all, you might notice the character now has colours. This is because I've added a new shader to the character. This is using the RealToon shader, which you can find on the asset store. I've decided to not go with outlines, so this is kind of like cel-shaded, but it's kind of like an anime style shader, but I'm using not flat colours. I've still got like shading in the colours. So you kind of have like this kind of pseudo kind of anime look to it. I did experiment a bit with diffuse shaders to see how they would look. You can see like the sheath still using a diffuse shader and the sword is still using a diffuse shader at the moment, but I think this looks probably the best. So I'll probably develop this, see how it goes. I'm not really somebody who knows how to code shaders, so that's like the one thing I haven't learned. I may be limited on certain things though as a result of RealToon, and also she's still in her underwear, so eventually she'll have clothes, you know, maybe next devlog, who knows. So let's move on to some of the changes I've done to the combat systems. You may remember the animator last time, they kind of branched into each other, but now they all come from the any state. This is basically because I've completely reworked how it works, so I've got a bit more flexibility. So from, say, a light attack, we can go into any heavy attack. Because I'm thinking there might be weapons where I want a different heavy attack chaining from the light attack, so I've basically redesigned the system to make it more flexible. So with that, I've had to completely change the skill class. Now it's called skill group. So we have our enter ID here. So I've made this nice little drop down menu. This isn't using enums, this is actually using my own system that I've created. So I've created this like index. So I can kind of, in here I can add in, like, say if I set two hand, and then I can give it the animation ID I want. This could be like 210 or something like that. So now back on the skill group, when we go into our enter ID and we open this, we've now got two hand light. So this is basically like a name and a number reference, so we can easily just choose them from a list rather than typing in the number manually. Just basically a little organization thing for me to make it a bit easier. Now skill groups are now split into multiple skills. So in this case we've got a light and a heavy attack. So this is for strike 1. So this is hold strike 1. So we've got attack 1 hold here. That's what this animation's associated with. So when we first go in, we go through this here and we enter the hold state. And then while we're in the hold state, it will then check for these circumstances. So you'll see here there's a little section called release window. So the release window is when the button's released, when this attack will trigger. Whereas this one, you'll see that it's like later on. So from 0 to 0.4, if it's released within that time, we get a light attack. But if it's past that time, we get the heavy attack. And then you'll also notice a bunch of other things that have came here. So we've got obviously the animation that it triggers. So again, these are like the ones that I've set up in the index. Then we've got our FX. So the prefab for the effects and FX pool. So I'll go into that later. And then we'll have a profile for that specific effects. Now, if I were to put this onto test 1, this mesh effects profile doesn't apply to this specific effect. But I'll go into more detail on that in a moment. Then we've got this combo skill group. So this is the skill of which this attack will combo into. So technically I could set up so a heavy attack could combo into a different skill entirely. And then we've got a damage multiplier per skill. So the light attack at the moment is just set to 1 and this is set to 1. The damage isn't implemented yet. We're still dealing with the visual aspects of these attacks. But this basically means I could add a new one here and we could have this like super heavy. And then we could have like a smaller release window at the end for this and so on and so forth. So with this I had to adjust a lot of scripts, especially these SMB scripts which are on the behaviors themselves, just to suit this new system. So there was a lot of work involved there, but that's, as you can see, there's a lot of these, so we'll go through these in a minute. But before we do, we'll move into the effects pool. So this is an example of effects pool. Basically, we have a prefab, which is a reference, so it's using the addressable system so we can load these in and out of memory. And this acts as like a container for loading in an asset and then creating a pool for it. So what pooling is we load in an asset, spawn it into the game, and then when we want to use it, we pull it from the pool, and then it executes whatever animation or whatever it needs, and then it puts it back into a box, but it doesn't completely delete it. So you're not constantly creating and deleting assets. So I've set up a couple of pools here. We've got this one for test 1 and this one for test 2. So these are a yellow cube and a red cube. So I set it up so when I press a number key, it will create the cube in the world. On the cube there is a timer that when the timer runs out, it returns it back into the pool. So there's a yellow cube, and now over here we've got VFX pool, and here is the cube. So if I were to enable this again, you can see it. So it's basically in memory, but it's disabled. So now if I were to press the button again, instead of creating a new cube, it will actually take this one out the pool and put it into the world, and then replace it back. This is auto scalable, so if I were to tap the button twice now, we'll now get 2 cubes instead. So the one it will take from the pool and then create a new one from scratch. As you can see now, there's 2. So this is basically scalable. So now if I were to just spawn 1 cube, it'll take that one out. If I were to do 2, we've still only got 2 cubes. Now if I tap 3 times, again, now we've got 3. So depending on how many effects are going off, this will scale. At the moment I haven't implemented it, but eventually there'll be a timer on these cubes, so over so much time, if they're not being used, the pool will scale itself down to meet the requirements. So this is basically just like asset management. There'll be situations in the game where an enemy will use a certain attack, it will spawn it into memory, it will happen, and then go back into a pool to be called again and pulled in and out of the pool. And then when the enemy dies, over time, that will be loaded out of memory because it no longer needs to be used. So basically it's just kind of asset management memory kind of thing. So the other thing with this is each of these have their own individual pool. So if I were to press number 1 now, we'll get a red cube instead. Now we've got tester 2 in here. So if I were to press 0, it'll pull out a yellow cube. If I press tester 2, so on and so forth. So I can keep tapping tester 2 here. And now we've got a bunch of these number 2s in there. So whenever it needs a number 2 or a number 1, it will pull them out. So this principle is going to be applied to slash effects, and it's going to be applied to basically any effect in the game. When you hit something, there'll be like a flash effect or a blood effect or whatever it is that happens. This system will use that, and they're easy to set up because these are using scriptable objects. These are like little pools for each one. So this brings me on to the more complicated implementation of this. So where we've got visual effects settings on the skill, we've got the effects. So this will be the pool that it's drawing from. So we've got slash effects prefab here. And then we've got this mesh effects profile. So I'm going to have to show you how slash effects work. And it's kind of complicated, so bear with me. So this is a slash effects wedge. So it's this weird wedge shape that basically it's got 2 armature points. One to move the center and the other to move the edge. So this means we can kind of change the shape or change the offset of the center, kind of make these different shapes using it. We'll put a texture onto this and then we'll essentially turn the wedge and animate it in a way that it creates a slash effect. This is how typically a lot of these slash effects are done. It's kind of hard to explain because it's kind of a bit of a weird concept. But you're basically animating the texture within the wedge and changing the shape of the wedge to create these slash effects. So this is the shader in ShaderGraph that I've made. So I'm not somebody who can program shaders very well, but I can use ShaderGraph. So this is what I've basically made. I made this a little while back, so I don't really remember exactly how it all works. And I have adjusted it slightly to kind of meet my new needs for this current project. But what a shader basically does is it's how the texture and everything is rendered onto the actual mesh itself. So I'll show you the mesh actually in game so you can kind of get a good idea of how this all works. So this is what the slash effect looks like in game, that wedge shape. You can see that all this is transparent except for this little texture here. So this here is the material for this wedge. This is using that shader that I showed earlier. So we've got all these parameters here that control this material. If I were to change the X, you'll see that this rotates around. This is how I used to do it. But the problem is when you get to this certain point, this is where there's a seam for the texture, and you'll notice that it actually disappears. To fix this, I ended up, instead of doing that, I have this set at 1. So we know this is where the seam is right here. And then I'm basically rotating this instead on a pivot point. So it'll go round like this. So while that's rotating, we then scale this X here. So this is like the textures scale. So we can scale this backwards and forwards so we can kind of make the slash look bigger or smaller. And then while that's happening, we can also then animate the alpha level, or the alpha clipping, or the intensity, which is the difference between the colours, how intense the colours are, or the colour blending. So do we have more of the dark red or the light red? And then obviously we can set the white colour and the black colour. So we could change this to like a blue or a purple, and then you can kind of blend it in. So we've got blue and then it like makes a purple, and then so you can kind of see how that works visually there. So how all this works is we've got two masks. We've got a colour mask here, which is this kind of shape, and this determines what colours what. So you'll see that there's this hard red here and this dark red here. So you can see that on the texture. We've got this light bit, this kind of grey bit, and then this dark bit, and that will determine what colours show up on the actual wedge itself. And then the second mask here, this is our alpha mask. So as you can see, you've got these white blobs here and then this gradient. So as we change the alpha clipping, it goes from dark up to the lighter colours and kind of removes them from the actual mesh. This is it at full, and then as we kind of reduce it, it kind of fades out. And then we kind of coincide this with the actual alpha level and everything, and you'll kind of get a good idea once I actually show you an animation with this. So this brings me onto the slash effects profile. So this is basically a profile that we set up for a slash effect. We've got a start point and the amount that it spins, and then an animation curve to kind of how it animates through those values. And then this is also applied to the texture settings, which is the scale, so how it expands and then contracts, like the length of the actual texture. Again, we've got an animation curve for that. Then we can set our colours and our masks here, so we can have different colours and masks depending on what weapon it is. So say if we've got, say, a mace, we might want a thicker, less slash looking kind of streak, so we kind of set them here. And then we've also then got our colour intensity, the fade between the two colours, colour cutoff, and then like how it cuts off, and we've got again animation curves for all those kind of things. Transform settings is what I showed you earlier in Blender, where we kind of changed the center or the edge of the actual effect. I'll probably put some footage of me like animating one of the attacks on the screen so you can kind of see how I'm adjusting these values to try and get the shape. And then we've obviously got like the spin, the tilt, the tip. This determines like the orientation of the attack. So how this all works is when the effect spawned in, we've got this slash effect control, which is on the actual prefab itself. The mesh effects profile is then fed into this, and then it plays it, and then when it's finished, it then returns it back to the pool. So I'll actually show you this working properly in game now. So if I swing my sword now, you get the slash effect. This works for both attacks. We've got them for the heavy attacks as well, but they're kind of still work in progress. I've only worked on them a bit. The normal attacks are a bit more finalized. So if you go back into the animator and press on light slash, we can see here we've got a skill effects settings, and this basically we get to choose what time this occurs, and then we can kind of choose. I've got this new slider set up here, so we can choose attack light here, And then this will change the effects time into frames based on the animation we've implemented here, or we could just have none and then put it in as a normal time. So that's a normal time from 0 to 1 of like a percentage value of the actual animation. So I've kind of got this option here now that I've set up, which is true for a lot of these kind of animation based sliders. And what it does is it pulls from the actual skill itself. So like here we've got light attack, we've got the mesh profile, so it pulls this profile and it pulls this effects from here when this attack happens. The actual skill and attack is determined by a different script, but this basically goes, okay, we're going to apply this attack animation here. The reason I set it up this way is so I can reuse animations. So if I were to have a club and I wanted a different animation and a different skill setting, different damage values and all that kind of stuff, I can still set those up but still reuse this animation and the ID and everything. So it's all kind of modular and it all works together. So lastly, I'm just going to go through these scripts that I've added to the animation states that kind of control how they work. So first of all, we've got this block move input. This stops us from moving during this time, so between 0 and 0.65% of the animation. So once we go past this point, we'll be able to move again. So I'll just demonstrate that quick. So I'm holding left and then I attack and then I start to move again. That's basically how that works. So in the last devlog, I showed this script, which basically determines the time where the input for a combo can be put in. But I've also added a natural time and an input exit time. So the natural exit time is the point of the animation where we would just return back to the idle. And then the input exit time is when you can put in an input and interrupt the attack. So basically these are like animation cancel times. So if I were to attack and then move, I actually break out of the animation. But then if I were to attack and then attack again, you can see I can keep triggering the first attack in the combo if I time it right. If I were to spam the button, I obviously do this, but if I then tap it, I can just trigger the first attack over and over. This is basically just to help with game feel, to make it feel a little bit better, so you don't feel like you're getting locked in an animation for too long, that you can still move out of it. Next on these, we've got the enable turn. So this is like a time frame where we can actually enable the character to be able to turn. On the actual attack itself, it's only a small window, but on the hold, it's for the entirety of the animation. This allows us to basically turn the character around before we actually attack. So I'll show that now. Again, this is just a case of game feel, so in the case where there's an enemy in front of you and you want to slightly adjust to attack, that's how this is going to work. So the last script we have here is the move command script. This basically tells the character to move in a certain direction. We can kind of set if it's local or world. We can kind of change this from speed to time depending on if we wanted to have a speed input and a time, or a distance input and a speed. So we can kind of pick and choose what our inputs are to determine the movement. I'm using distance and time at the moment, so it's going to move a distance of 1.5 for a time of 0.05, and then it's going to be at this frame. Once again, this has where we can pick the animation, so we can pick frames or the actual percentage of the animation. And then we've also got a ledge stop or a jump, which kind of works like how the dodge is, so we can kind of set when we hit a ledge, do we jump over the ledge, or do we stop at the ledge, or do we do none and just drop off the edge. And then the last thing is a curve to say the attack starts slow, goes quickly, and then slows down towards the end. So you'll see now that we actually move forward a little bit when we attack. And this is the same for each attack that we've got set up. And then when we attack at a ledge, it will stop at the ledge and not continue forward and push us off. So this is how it looks in slow motion, so you can kind of see how I've tried to make it match the animation as best as possible so we don't look like we're skating along. Next time I'll be working on the damage pipeline. This will include some more unique features that I've been planning with regards to how armor will work. I'm going to introduce some static punching bags and traps that hit the player before introducing actual enemies though. Here's a quick overview of my short-term plan. I think it'll be important to get the basic level design in before I introduce the enemies, so that I can ensure they will work with the type of environments I will be creating. If you like what you see, be sure to leave a like and a comment to help me against the algorithm gods. And make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you're updated whenever I release a new video. To support me financially, I have a Patreon, but be aware there won't be any builds going up anytime soon. Once again, thanks thanks to the existing patrons, your generosity is very much appreciated. As for the rest of you, I highly recommend you go and watch the last devlog here to see how I get all these animations working. And if you don't want to do any of that, would you kindly bugger off?
Maybe.